So I'm gonna start. All right, so Grave of the Fireflies. So we're moving from the Wind Rises, and we're going to Miyazaki's mentor Isao Takahata.
Do
Uh,
you want to record?
I am recording it.
Sorry.
You are the worst producer. No, okay. I, I record it from OBS.
I
Okay.
just forgot.
Okay. All right. Can you record from Discord? Okay. Anyway, so we're moving from the Wind Rises. We're going to Miyazaki's mentor Isao. We're going to Miyazaki's mentor Isao Takahata, who worked with Miyazaki at Toei Animation. The directors came together to make Nausicaa Valley of the Wind with another director, and then a few years later would found Studio Ghibli. The Wind Rises is nonfiction that's been fictionalized, whereas Grave of the Fireflies is fiction that's based on actual events. Grave of the Fireflies is a short story by novelist Akiyuki Nosaka that was based on key events in his life. The story was published in 1967, I believe, and I didn't write it in my notes, but it was about the author. It was a fictionalized event of things the author went through growing up during World War II. Um, Grave of the Fireflies starts by revealing the deaths of the main characters, which both sets up the contract for the viewer of this film as a tragedy and not as a, what they might expect from a cartoon film. Uh, uh, but it also sets up the tragic flaw of Japanese society. During wartime, the people are so obsessed with nationalism that they fail to take care of the people of the nation. And none of that actually changes in the post war Japan that is rebuilt in the image of the invading US. Um, the protagonist's aunt constantly praises her family members who are fighting for the nation of Japan while trashing her niece and nephew who are under her care. It brings up a question of what is a nation? Is it a political power structure, an idea, or is it comprised of the people within it? By losing their parents to war, the orphan protagonists become a charity case where otherwise they were not. And at that point, they lose their national identity. There's sort of this like irony of that the fact that it is the nation's drama of war that actually causes them to lose their Japanese status because they lose their parents to the war. And by losing their parents to the war, they lose their wealth, essentially. And once they are poor, they are seen as non-people, or at least not Japanese in a way. Um, and even as the whole nation is being rationed food, the protagonists are somehow particularly targeted as being beggars, as not having, as being without, even as everyone else is struggling so much that they're even preying off of the protagonists, who are probably the most down on their luck. Uh, Homeless Seta and Setsuko are the last to learn that the war has ended, because the transfer of power from like the Empire of Japan to a democratic nation built in the style of the U.S. and under General MacArthur's tutelage uh, doesn't actually change their quality of life. So they're actually the last to hear about it. The only thing is that the end of the war brings this hope that maybe their father might come home from the military. Um, And this is done to bring the indictment of Japan into the present day. It's not to say, look at, how difficult it was during the war. It's to say, like, nothing has changed after all of this. Takahata is saying this is a ongoing national shame what we do to the homeless. Um, and uh, as individuals struggle to survive to get their basic needs met in wartime Japan, uh, they begin to war with each other. Charity becomes scarce, people abandon their duties to each other, and everything becomes a zero sum game. Seida's hand is pushed more and more by people's lack of charity. He becomes a thief for food, but when a farmer beats him for stealing food, he then starts stealing stuff that is later to be sold for food. But by this point in the war, people's stuff isn't very good, and so this tactic doesn't really work out very well. This is very similar to articles that I've read about the U.S. now, where conservative politics are constantly built around creating this like idea that in the richest nation in the world, we are constantly like they are constantly under threat of losing their shit. And but on top of that, capitalism has kind of kept so much of us in this class where we're constantly struggling just for basic needs. And so then we kind of have this failure to, like, we don't thrive in America, we kind of just survive. And so that's why we constantly have these ideas about guns and being against socialism and being worried about our taxes, because and so it's one of those things where because we're constantly worried about someone taking our stuff, we don't actually think that through community we all actually get more stuff. And so this sort of victim mentality keeps us actually from thriving as a nation. And it keeps us in this like constant state of feeling we need guns to blow away the person who's going to come into our door, rather than think about, do we even have anything worth stealing? um, you know, and um, let's see. And so speaking of, there's a character of the greedy aunt who's kind of like the wicked stepmother in this case, where you have like the benign mother who is killed in war, and then they are sent. The protagonists are sent to struggle with the greedy aunt. Um, and she represents the typical hypocrisies of the middle class. They themselves benefit from social programs like hospitals, schools, food subsidies, streets, sewers, electric infrastructure. Everything else that's subsidized by the government. But they don't recognize this as a form of welfare. However, when others receive welfare, suddenly they become very opinionated about how they spend their time and energy and money. Um, Even as the bourgeoisie exploits the poor for profit, they resent the poor for not doing more to better their own situation. If the poor need time to recover from their traumas, then they aren't working, and then that's a problem. Uh, uh, if they're having fun, then they're not working, and then that's a problem. If the poor take part in the wealth that was exploited from them, then they're ungrateful to the power structures that are oppressing them. If the poor find a way to be self sufficient, then they're doing so in spite of the bourgeoisie. And there's no escaping the judgment. And the aunt here is essentially a stand in to ridicule modern sentiments about welfare. Um, and to shame this political thought that keeps the poor from actually receiving the support that they need, um, ultimately placing the tragedy of this narrative upon this mentality. We all want to feel sad for the characters in the Grave of the Fireflies, but we don't actually think about our role in their deaths. And that is sort of the point of this aunt. The story could have easily have been told without that entire chapter being included. In fact, the story is even more concise and more direct and solves a lot of problems if they didn't go that direction. But that aunt is there to for the commentary. It's the aunt is actually the center of the film. Like it's why the film even exists. Um, and it's that class violence that the middle class plays on the poor that returns back to them in the form of crime, which then sort of creates this self-validating argument where they're like, well, you know, the poor are bad people, and so then you refuse to help the poor, which then forces them to commit crime, which then validates this idea that they are bad people who do not deserve help. And so then there's just this cycle of poverty in this middle class mindset that really only serves the mentality of the middle class being superior to the poor. But it doesn't actually help either the middle class or the poor. Um, Aesthetically, there's an interesting argument that tends to come up with Takahata's work, um, which is that when you're working between different artistic mediums, you have to make a choice. What is the story that you're making? I make this argument against writers going into one particular genre because I've seen so many times poets have ideas for short stories, but because they're a poet, they focus only on turning it into a poem. And okay. And so they only focus on things becoming a poem. And that's not the right form for the work. Um and so uh it's generally seen as like a good choice between medium uh to test whether it could be told from another medium or not. And if the other medium is a better medium, then why are you not just choosing that? And Grave of the Fireflies, particularly, people ask, why is this not live action? Because there's absolutely no use of the animation medium. There's no like surrealist imagery. There's nothing that is, you know, particularly out of the ordinary, even for like a stage play. Like this could be easily adapted uh, for the stage, and for film, it could be shot for shot adapted without very much special effects. Um, and so people are like, why isn't this a live action? Um, and you know, let's see, I went a little off script, but yes, yeah, and let's see, and especially when animation is so much more expensive and time consuming than live action really is. Um, so two answers to that is, which is one, it's a like I mentioned before, like when you have a specialty, you tend to do things in that specialty. So this was picked up by animation people, and so it's going to be an animated work. Um, but the other thing is that this film was actually made into a live action adaptation, and no one actually talks about that. It's not like a particularly important piece of cinema history, whereas the animated version is. Um, and part of that is because the animation medium, even though none of the typical conventions and superpowers of animation are used, animation still is the winning medium here. Um, and so I'll skip around. So essentially, there's this aesthetic theory that an abstract medium is easier to identify with. because there are not distracting elements. The simpler the representation, then the less there is to be distracted. The more details, the more there's likely to be an offending detail. So, say, if you have a happy face, we could all identify with the happy face. But if you put like a scar over the happy face's eye, then you're just like, that is probably not me, right? And that one detail then becomes an offending detail that is then separating. And then you would need a lot more detail to sort of bridge that. Like, you'd need a lot more detail that is particularly connects with who you are versus who the character is, to then bridge that gap. If it's important to create empathy between the characters, or between the audience and the characters, animation is going to be the superior medium. And I think that is what Takahata was planning on doing with this. And what's interesting with Takahata as a director is he doesn't draw. I actually really relate with him as a director. He does draw, he does do his storyboards, but he is not like Miyazaki, who is a very much a visual artist. He more can do his storyboards, but he's not necessarily the go-to person to do your storyboards. Um, and because of that, he's actually more flexible in his style. Uh, at the very beginning, more of his works are realistic, but then he starts getting more and more into magical realism, and then he does create more. He does use more of what the animation style, what we would think of as why you would want to use animation. But even then, as live action is starting to kind of mix with animation, you could still even say that what he's doing could still be shot live action. Uh, and while people really focus on Takahata's sense of realism, it's really the small details that are the realism that he sticks with. So even as he goes from realism to magical realism, what he still focuses on is like this mountain of little truths. So if you compare the anatomy style of Takahata's work, the his characters have slightly more nuanced presentations of realistic reality than Miyazaki's work does. And on top of that, there is like a greater sense of realistic timing and realistic acting, and these are what's important to him. And you can kind of see this like exchange between him and Miyazaki, where Takahata's major importance is on these things, but then if you see documentaries of Miyazaki is also agonizing over the realism of how do you fold a shirt. If we're going to animate a character folding a shirt, we want to see, like, he would have like women from the office go like, could you let us videotape you folding a shirt like you would for your husband? And then they would like fold it, and he would then fold it with them to be like, how does the shirt feel, how does it look, how does it tend to wrinkle on the thing? And so it's like, and Takahata also, like, he does that too. Famously in this film, there's a part where the character cuts a watermelon with a knife, and he regrets it, and he's like, or the director regrets how it was done, because he's like, there was no weight on the knife. It felt like they were cutting through tofu, is what he says. And so then in the next film, he gets somebody to come in, and they all look at him as he cuts a melon open with a knife, and then sees how his technique is to split the thing apart, because he's like, I don't want to make that mistake again, because that doesn't feel real. And with animation, it is that timing and that acting that really conveys weight and reality. Because Takahata is interested in these things and how the specifics of how animation actually brings in uh, a sense of reality. He's not as interested in live action, which the reality of things is portrayed through the reality of things. Um, and so, uh, and part of that too is uh, the power of animation through expressions. He really cares about that character acting, and that's really the greater power of animation, is that the expressions come in much clearer than you're going to get with an actor's expressions, because in animation you can always slightly exaggerate, and because there is this subtractive logic where you can subtract um, you know distracting elements to it. In sound editing in EQ, the first thing you do is remove bad sounds from the waveform, and that is the first step to cleaning it up. And then you work on making the sound better. And I feel like animation kind of is that. It's that subtractive cleaning of the narrative performance. And that's it. This is a short one for for today. Um, anyway, movie time.